tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools, dusty death. We make no apology for thus posing the problem which confronts the world in a most urgent and dramatic form. The deserts of today were the green pastures of yesterday. And here, where the arid sands flow into forgotten drifts, the oxen and the plowshare.
This is no armchair problem, no dusty academic wrangle. This is an affair for you and me. That may not be your house floating down the river, or your family stranded in the floods. But don't comfort yourself with someone else's disaster. What does go swirling out to sea with the muddy wreckage is the plain, simple survival of your children and grandchildren. In dust storm and flood, the vital topsoil on which your food is grown vanishes into the sea, never to be replaced.
Even now, man has not learned from nature. The lessons of the past are too soon forgotten. Yet the ruins of the great civilizations of Rome, Babylon, Egypt, and of later dates all were largely caused by man's exploitation of the soil.
Almost everywhere civilized man has gone, he has exploited and destroyed and left behind him little but empty, barren sand. The lesson of history.
And modern scientific man has learned to repeat the process very much more quickly.
But of course, we say, it can't happen in Britain. Not in the enlightened 20th century.
Can't it? Can't it? This is England, 1950. The creeping paralysis of erosion is only too evident to those who can see. The warning that we're on our way to the desert has been sounded. Let us now see how and why.
For instance, this touches you, madam, in 101 vital ways. But how often does it pass through your mind as you do your daily shopping?
Soil erosion and me? That's certainly a new one.
What's in that basket of yours?
Oh, just the rations, some bread and vegetables.
Just the rations, as though the things we eat don't really matter. And food comes directly from the soil. But remember, that fur coat and those silk stockings also come in the first place from the earth, or the insects and animals that feed the soil. Those smart city shoes you and your husband are wearing. And those country cousins you see at the weekend. Those evening dresses. And morning suits. Champagne. Beer. Even that nice cup of tea. All these things could never exist but for the living soil.
But what do you mean by the living soil? Is the earth really alive?
Oh, the topsoil's alive, all right. But you fellows who live in the cities don't usually bother to work it out.
But what's the difference between the topsoil and the subsoil?
I'll tell you in a minute. But to put it in a nutshell, the one's alive, the other's inert. You can grow things in a topsoil, not in a subsoil.
I seem to remember reading some time ago that life invades the mineral rock and converts it into soil at the rate of about 1 inch every 500 to 1,000 years. Well, if that's so, what's all the fuss about?
Do you know how much topsoil is washed into the sea every year by the USA rivers alone?
No.
500 to 1,000 million tons. That is to say, $2,000 million worth of plant food, or 21 times the amount annually removed in crops. In 1 year, what they call the Dust Bowl advanced 40 miles, and every year the equivalent of 27,000 40-acre farms disappear. Now, there's your topsoil. That's what nature took millions of years in making. Fine, rich stuff, full of bacteria, worms and humus.
Worms? When I dig them up, I generally throw them to the robins.
Well, you won't be doing that when you found out a bit more about them. Earthworms, that's the sign of a good, healthy soil.
A little while ago, you were telling me that a fertile soil consists of minerals and humus. What do you mean by humus?
I suppose you can describe humus by saying it's organic matter in transition stage from one sort of life to another. The word that matters there is organic. that is to say living. Well, there you are. Nature has been doing this all the time. Has been doing it for millions of years until man came along and interfered. That's what we call the forest floor.
The forest floor is virgin soil rich in humus, which it builds up as the result of nature's observance of the law of return. From the life-sustaining humus of the soil, the plants and trees draw their essential nourishment. In the course of the seasons, every plant and tree returns to the earth its outworn leaves and other residues. These are again transformed by the play of the elements, the bacteria and earthworms of the soil, into rich humus. Thus, nature works to a strict ordered pattern, from life through growth, decay, and death to renewed life. Now, what happens when the pioneer farmer clears and starts to cultivate the land? First, he cuts down the woodland and upsets the natural order of the terrain. He breaks the cycle and disrupts the ecology, which is the natural association of the plants, trees, and animals with each other in a particular locality. The farmer grows his crops, and in the main, the residues which should be returned to the soil to ensure its fertility are either carried away to some other place or burnt as rubbish. If the land is to continue to maintain its fertility, the present trends in agriculture must be reversed. The farmer and gardener must learn to understand and work with, not against nature. The fundamental law of return must be observed. The old-time farmer was instinctively aware of this cycle. Before the days of mechanization, a community lived off the land where it dwelt, and all the wastes of that community were returned to the land. What comes out must go back was a rule he never for a moment thought of disobeying, because it was the natural thing to do.
But about a century ago, the Industrial Revolution was really getting into its stride. Factories, slums, the new marvels of engineering changed the face of Britain and the world. This broke up a balanced community and herded masses in towns so that food had to come in from a distance and waste didn't get back to the land. This led to falling yields. Inevitably, the slow process of agriculture came under review, and chemists began to break down the chemical composition of the earth. Believing that only chemical food was being lost to the land, and that there were no secrets which the microscope and test tube would not reveal, the German chemist Liebig propounded the theory that everything necessary for successful plant growth was to be found in the ashes of that plant after it was burnt and all organic matter destroyed. Thus the age of the chemical fertilizer began. To begin with, the results were almost too good to be true. The new fertilizer not only saved time, labor, and money — it was easier to scatter a hundredweight of chemical dust than shift a ton of muck — it also produced a bigger crop, again, on lands where the yield had fallen. With quality apparently unimportant, quantity became the paramount factor. Moreover, in times of depression, the farmer had no alternative. He was forced to maintain his output and at the same time cut his costs. Instead of being returned to the land, straw and other residues were burnt. For a time, however, the humus already in the ground through years of previous good husbandry, or the millennia of virgin forest, sufficed to withstand the chemical assault. That was the capital reserve, and when diseases, which are the first symptoms of malnutrition, began to appear, the skill of the chemists was sought to provide another quick remedy. But this in turn proved to be a vicious circle. Soon there were chemical controls for diseases unheard of in the days of muck farming. And all the time, more and more fertilizer was necessary to achieve the same results.
Who kills the bees that pollinate the blossoms? Later on, human beings are going to eat those apples, and if you apply this principle to the whole range of agriculture all over the world, there may well be one or two worries for thoughtful people like you and me. We eat to live. Who knows? Possibly to die.
If a factory can set up a production line, then so can I, says many a modern farmer. With everything mechanized and costs calculated to the penny, he has to. Sugar beet is an excellent case in point. To grow a paying crop, the land must be treated as part of an industrial system. But with the harvest goes the vital topsoil. Washed off at the factory, the soil is lost forever. It is lost almost without a thought. But one year, strange patches begin to appear in your crops. Epidemic strikes at your cattle. and from cattle to human beings is only a short step. Is it merely coincidence that we, too, find our resistance to disease strangely lowered, although the quantity of food may remain the same? Do our easy and conveniently tinned foods lack something vital? Has this living chain effect ever been scientifically studied? Hear what Sir Robert McCarrison, formerly Director of Nutrition Research in India, has to say.
It may therefore be taken as an axiom that the greatest single factor in promoting good health is the right kind of food. And the principal cause of many illnesses is faulty nutrition caused by the wrong kind of food. But besides the right kinds of food, the quality of the foods themselves is important. This depends on the soil conditions in which they are grown and on methods of cultivation. While if they are produced on impoverished soil, their quality will be poor. The health of those that eat them, man and his domestic animals, will suffer accordingly. In India, I found that certain food grains, when grown in soil manured with farmyard manure, were of higher nutritional value than when grown in soil manured with chemical manure. In many parts of the world, impoverishment of the soil goes on apace, because man takes out of it more than he puts back in animal and other organic manure. This leads to infertility in the soil, which in its turn leads to a whole train of events, culminating in faulty nutrition with resultant diseases in plants, beasts, and man.
These conclusions are sustained by the pioneer work of the late Sir Albert Howard in India. He found that adequate supplies of humus were essential to a healthy soil. Humus is the result of the decomposition of plant and animal residues by microorganisms. The best humus is composed of a mixture of plant and animal wastes. Such wastes, when decomposed by scientific composting, are immediately available as food to the soil population through which plants feed under natural conditions. He proved that the application of humus to the soil increased fertility and gave all crops a marked disease resistance, which is transmitted to the animals fed on such crops.
It was at the Forestry Commission's nursery at Wareham Heath in Dorset that the late Dr. Rayner started experiments with soil fungi. She found that one of the most important roots of them lives in partnership with the roots of plants, and that without it, trees fail to make proper growth. This fungus cannot grow in the normal Wareham soil, and the difference its presence or absence can make on trees of the same age is readily seen in this example. Microphotographs show how the fungus provides the plants with essential food. By penetrating the roots, the threads of the fungus find their way between the root cells and convey a constant stream of nutrients which seem to be necessary to full vigor and disease resistance of the plants, just as vitamins are necessary to animals and man. The difference in growth between these stunted trees in normal Wareham soil and these identically aged ones in composted soil goes far to prove the doctor's findings that composting with organic matter is a highly effective means of ensuring the efficiency of the partner fungus in the soil.
Another extremely useful member of the soil population is the earthworm, which improves the structure of the soil, helping the penetration of the rain and air. The casts, which are brought to the surface at an average weight of over 10 tons per acre in fertile soil every year, are far richer in nitrogen, phosphate and potash than the surrounding unworked soil. This is caused by the intimate mixing of organic matter, mineral soil, and the digestive juices of the worm. Sensitive to chemical salts, their numbers decrease rapidly where chemicals are the main fertilizing agent, but on the natural organic waste of composted land, they thrive. A really vigorous earthworm population is of the utmost importance to soil fertility.
Let us look at the practical results of composting. First, in the private garden. Here are crops grown in a drought year of 1949, with no additional watering. A bed of onions with an average weight of 1 pound. This one tips the scale at 1.5 pounds. Brussels sprouts as big as these in August. None have had chemicals, none have been sprayed. For the market gardener too, compost is no less useful. On this holding, the fertility of the ground had been used up by intensive cropping, and in 1940, the owner had either to move out or try to restore the fertility by composting. He chose compost, and by 1949 he could look back with satisfaction on his choice. Peonies, with 8 to 12 blooms per plant instead of the 3 to 5 average for their age. Greenhouses where tomatoes have been grown for 5 years running without the need for any kind of soil sterilization. And lettuce crops, which in a year noted for the fearful damage done by apis, produced a perfectly clean and magnificently sized crop, whilst holdings on either side had to use sprays and dusts to try and save theirs from total destruction. Perhaps even more dramatic is this change from scrubby downland into prosperous farming country. On only the narrowest layer of topsoil, this farmer finds that organic transmission gives this soil all it needs to produce healthy and bountiful crops. At one place on this farm, the ground is as stony as a beach, and yet, even here, a good healthy crop of winter barley is growing. To watch sheep and cattle grazing on land that was waste a short time ago, and to know that the fertility of the soil is actually being raised all the while, is proof of the way in which man can work with nature when he sets his mind to it.
We have now seen the close contact between healthy soils, healthy crops, healthy animals, and healthy people. Health is wholeness. We can only have it if we maintain the cycle of life and obey the law of return.
How best is this to be achieved? One of the keys lies in the word compost. So now let us see the practical side of compost making.
First, in the garden. To begin with, the raw material is collected into a heap. Here it is also being mixed with sawdust, though this is not an essential. A short list of the materials you could put into the garden compost heap looks something like this. Using a rough wooden box, the first step is to put in ventilation posts round which you put the bottom layer. This should always be thick material, such as cabbage stalks, to assist ventilation. For garden composting, a box is used to keep it compact and prevent it getting too dry or too wet. On top of the cabbage stalks, a layer of mixed vegetable waste, either long or, as in this case, chopped, is then put to a depth of about 6 inches. Next, a layer of organic activator. In this example, fish refuse is being used, but any animal waste, such as poultry manure, will do quite as well. Then a sprinkling of chalk or natural ground limestone to keep the heap sweet. Don't confuse natural rock with chemical fertilizer. Finally, a thin layer of ordinary sieved soil. This is to introduce essential bacteria into the heap, where, with another 6-inch layer of vegetable wastes, the process you have just seen is repeated until the heap reaches the top of the box. The top should be covered with a thick layer of soil. This is to conserve the heat generated inside, so that decomposition can continue at an even pace. All that now remains is to pull out the poles to leave ventilation channels and cover up the heap to keep out the weather. 3 weeks later, the heap is opened up and turned. Already, it has greatly rotted down, and all that remains of the fish bones, for example, are odd pieces like this, which crumble into a fine powder containing about 60% phosphates. It is now forked into another bin, where it'll spend a further 3 weeks. If, at this stage, it is found to be too dry, it should be lightly watered while being turned. At 6 weeks, the heap is once again opened up. The compost is now much further advanced. Finer in texture, it is altogether easier to handle. There's no further need for boxes, and although it will be yet another 3 weeks before fully matured, it can safely be left in the open with only a windbreak as shelter. At last, after 9 to 12 weeks, the process is complete, and the compost you see here is now ready for the land. Its quality may surprise those who confuse it with its raw materials, such as manure. This compost is clean and friable. It smells sweet, and in it lies some of the essence of life. It loses none of its virtue, even when sieved. And this substance, this final and essential link in the chain of life, does not even dirty the hands that touch it. For the farm, where larger amounts are needed, the technique changes. Much of it is done almost automatically in the stockyard itself, as here on this typical medium-sized farm. Over the weeks, the straw and manure are continually mixed with sprinklings of chalk. The result is then mechanically loaded and taken out to the fields. Here it is built into heaps about 10 feet by 5 by 5 feet, with layers of whatever green stuff is to hand. These heaps are again built round ventilation poles, which are later removed. The self-heating process is rapid, and after 3 to 4 weeks, the heap is turned by a mechanical elevator, which feeds on to a tripod, thus breaking up the compost as it falls. After another turning, the compost is sufficiently fine for agricultural purposes, and all that now remains is to spread it on the fields. On larger farms, mechanical grabs driven by a tractor enable the loading and turning operations to be done by one man. Why not use the progress of science to lower your costs? On this highly mechanized farm, the cost of handling farmyard manure is only 5 shillings a ton, and that includes spreading it on the land. But even if farmers and gardeners compost all their own waste, there is still a vast break in the life cycle which must be stopped if we are to survive. Composting of city waste by municipal authorities must be undertaken as a matter of urgency. They are the only people in a position to do it. And public opinion, your opinion, must force them to make a start. That it can be done has been proved by 1 or 2 pioneer spirits, as for example at Dumfries, where the county council used waste such as straw, bracken and grass with sewage to make compost, which is in great demand by the local farmers.
Thus we see how compost for various purposes can be made and how its use completes the cycle of life. On the Hawley Research Farm in Suffolk, managed by the Soil Association, an important and unique long-term experiment under qualified scientific direction is in progress to find out more about these natural laws and the best way to put them into practice. Here is a scale model of the Hawley Research Farm. Note the small, flat fields, eminently suitable for a comparative manurial experiment. The Hawley estate covers 210 acres. The actual working area of the arable land being used for this experiment amounts to 130 acres. Hawley is managed as 3 separate farms, one a mixed section, one all organic, and a third stockless. The mixed section of 70 acres is farmed on orthodox lines, farmyard manure and fertilizers being used throughout. The all-organic section is of 68 acres. Here, no artificial fertilizers are used, and all farmyard manure is made into compost. The stockless section, with no livestock, and so no farmyard manure, depends on chemical fertilizers and ploughed-in green crops. A glance over some of the fields at Hawley shows the farm scale of this inquiry into the merits of different types of soil management. Each section, or farm within a farm, is producing its own seed grain, and except for the stockless section, feeding its own livestock. Thus, in time, the effects of the 3 comparative soil treatments will be effectively tested through several generations of plants and animals. Visitors to Hawley wishing to study the experiment at first hand, and their number is increasing all the time, can be accommodated at Walnut Tree Manor. This charming old 17th century house has been equipped especially for the purpose. Guests are welcome to stay for any period, and for those interested, weekend study courses are arranged from time to time. Our story is nearly told.
You have seen how ancient civilizations reduced their lands to deserts.
You have seen why virgin soil is naturally fertile.
You have seen how trouble starts when pioneers interfere with this natural cycle.
You have seen that the health of man depends on the food he eats, not the quantity, but the quality, which only a living soil can yield.
Something vital is lacking today. Man has turned his back upon the law of return. Millions of acres have become devitalized. Forgotten is the greatest principle of all, the unbroken cycle of life, which alone can ensure that full fertility and crop yields are maintained indefinitely.
The vast majority of the peoples of the world have not the slightest idea of the grim picture of famine and death which threatens them.
You are now no longer uninformed. And for your further evidence, there is a wealth of literature dealing with every phase of the whole problem which faces the governments of the world and every one of us today.
Whether you live in the town or in the country, with a backyard patch or a large-scale farm, you, as an individual, can aid by adding your voice to the united opinion of the Soil Association. Your active support will strengthen its growing influence for a healthier and happier world, and indeed, for the ultimate survival of mankind.